Hello, everybody. Welcome to the final session of Food Diversity Day, the first ever Food Diversity Day, hopefully not the last. My name is Pete Brown. I'm a writer mainly specialising in drink, particularly beer and a bit of cider. And we've got a great panel today to talk about diversity in alcohol, perfect for last session on a Friday. Before I introduce our panel, it's great to be invited to do this. When you look at food and drink broadly, every culture around the world values its fermented food and drink probably more than anything else that they have in their diet. And obviously fermentation and booze is a pretty significant part of that. And it's striking when you look, I think, at any alcohol market, that the level of globalization kind of lags behind other markets. You know, when you think coffee, you think Starbucks, you think burgers, you think McDonald's. For any booze, there's not really an equivalent. There's not really kind of one huge beer brand or cider brand or wine brand that dominates the world. So drink has always been a little bit more diverse than a lot of other products. But that doesn't mean that it's not a threat. There are people working very hard to try and create those big global brands and create that kind of uniformity that makes it easy for them and a bit more boring for the rest of us. So there are initiatives across drink to help preserve the diversity. Alcohol. I think it's a wonderful fact that any culture in the world has at some point figured out how to ferment sugars in plants to create alcohol. No matter where you are, no matter what's growing, there's something that you can get the sugar out of it and turn into alcohol, and that leads us to an incredible, wonderful diversity of drinks. We're going to be hearing about several of them over the next hour, and obviously those raw materials change wherever you go in the world. There are places where grapes grow better, places where grain grows better. But in those regions, there's lots and lots of different varieties. We tend not to think about it, particularly in beer, but the variety of hops, the variety of barley in cider, the apples and perry pears, and some of the varieties are getting very rare and verging on extinction. And we're going to be talking about why it would be a good idea to not let that happen. So we've got an absolutely fantastic panel to talk through some of these issues. We've got Sarah Abbott, who's a Master of Wine and founder of the Old Vine Conference. So she's going to be telling us all about that in a minute. Chava from Mexico has stepped in at the last minute because his colleague was on a plane at the moment.
Yes, he's on his way to Mexico for a huge party that might get 10 years of his life expectancy, but whatever.
Well, thank you for joining us in this place, Chava. Chava is part of work on the Agave Road Trip, so we're going to be hearing about mescal and agave and the importance there. We have Gabe Cook, the ciderologist, the world's most famous expert in cider and perry. So we're going to ask Gabe to juggle a couple of very different drinks there. They often get put together, but they are quite different. We have Marc Millon, who is with his partner has been traveling and writing about food and drink for 40 years, and I think Marc's going to be talking to us about Italian wines and some of the things that are happening there. And then we have John Letts. Glad you got in at just the last minute there, John. Thank you for joining us. And John is an organic plant breeder and archaeologist based in Buckinghamshire, who's been working with heritage grains for the last 25 years. So I'm particularly so interested to hear about what you've been up to there. So we're going to speak for about 5 minutes each. I'll be asking a few questions, and then if we do have time when everyone's said their piece, we'll have a few questions and a bit of a chat. But I'm really curious about what we can learn from each other in this. We're all doing very similar things in very different parallel fields, and I think the benefit of something like this is swapping notes and realizing that we've all got things that we can maybe help each other. So if I could start with Sarah. Sarah, tell us about the Old Vine Conference. What is that?
Okay, so it's a non-profit. It was a lockdown project. We founded it just coming up to 2 years ago. And the reason why old vines are important and why they are an arc of biodiversity is just worth picking up on. So there are about 10,000 wine grape varieties in the world, 10,000. You know, it's a joy. It's a marketing differentiator's joy. It's just a free gift. But there are about 10 varieties that dominate. And you probably, you know, if you've had wine, then you'd have heard of them. It's Cabernet Sauvignon, Merlot, Sauvignon Blanc, Chardonnay, Pinot Grigio, and that's fine. But just to give you an idea, 13 grape varieties basically make up about 1/3 of the world's planted wine vineyards. So there's that to bear in mind. And the reason why old vines are important, just to go back a bit, is just to recap that in wine, there are these two huge events that kind of started to change the course of how wine is farmed. One of them was in the 1850s when this basically a pathogen came into the vineyards of Europe. It's called phylloxera, and it basically started to just kill vineyards. They would literally just wither and die. And this led to a lot of vineyards in France, Spain, Italy, essentially being abandoned until the cure was found, which was grafting. And then the second huge kind of inflection point in wine was really the post-Second World War, the Green Revolution. And I know this is something that you will find common across all farming. You know, when we moved as a society out of often quite, you know, desperate need to feed the world, you know, we moved from the more kind of you know, cottage farming, you know, very localized methods of farming, into a much more consolidated and then industrialized way of approaching farming. It's just the same for wine. And the reason why we founded the Old Vine Conference is because, so my day job is actually, I help producers from lesser known regions, so all the weird stuff, to promote their wines and their vineyards, because wine is such a high value product. It brings so much value to rural communities. If you can elevate the reputation of local wines and bring them kind of recognition, it leads to all kinds of great benefits for those communities. And it keeps people working in the countryside. But essentially, I and some colleagues were talking about how we know that old vines are kind of, it's like a term that becomes a proxy for a certain approach to viticulture, which is about heritage methods, really indigenous varieties, you know, often that are only planted in that place, very particular methods of farming that are really naturally sustainable. And the sustainability comes out of a frugality of working with what you have. And that kind of frugality, which comes of ingenuity. I mean, the ingenuity is what makes everything delicious, isn't it? You know, it's like the struggle. The struggle is really beautiful. And you see this in cheese, and you know, you see this everywhere. It's because people will do anything for something they think, to make something they think is tasty, and also to make a living. And all the things that we think are beautiful come out of this struggle, a kind of a struggle to make something tasty and with what you have. So we founded the Old Vine Conference because loads of these old vineyards, which are typically planted on steep slopes, inaccessible areas, they were planted before, you know, you had mechanical hoes or plows, and they were planted in places that were naturally what we'd now call regenerative or sustainable, because people were frugal. And if you're going to go to the effort of planting a vineyard, you want to know it's in the right place, it's the right variety, it's going to be resilient and healthy naturally for 30, 40, 50 years. Oh, sorry, that's my timer. To tell myself my 5 minutes are up. So we started the Old Vine Conference. The aim is to bring all of the wine producers that we know around the world together so that they can communicate what we mean by old vines. And we've just had the news actually that the Ministry of Agriculture in Italy, I think you might have seen this, Mark, has just passed a proclamation that they are actually going to start recognizing and protecting old vines, heritage vineyards in Italy, and everything that old vines represent. So our website is oldvines.org. We've had amazing support, and we'll be running an Old Vine Wine Week in March. And yeah, more information on the website, but I don't want to, you know, like bust anyone else's timing. So there you go.
I'll just ask you, are there things that people can do? Are there certain brands that people can buy if they want to kind of support?
Yeah, there are. So if you have so we're a non-profit, and our website is oldvines.org. It also on the website is loads of information, links to regional organizations all over the world whose producers have come together to protect their local old vines. So you can click through into those. You can see who's working with old vines: the South Africans, the Chileans, Lodi in the USA. And I should just say, we've just had Italy has got an incredible number of fantastic old vines. I mean, you could have an Italian wine every single day, I know, and it would be new to you. This happens to me every time. But Italy is also coming together. I should say, Mark, we've got about 10 producers coming together from Italy who are working together about these old vines, with their old vines. And things like, for example, they would plant, so their vineyards would be planted and there'd be willow trees around them, because the willow tendrils is what they would use to tie the canes of the vines onto the posts. And guess what? They're really good for the vines, because when the vine swells with the sap, it doesn't cut off the flow. So it's so many of these things, they come from frugality and a kind of wisdom, and they're not sentimental. You know, they are actually truly sustainable. So have a look on the website. Loads of information, resources, pointers to people working with these heritage vineyards and heritage cuttings. And the wines are really sensational. They have a kind of inner kind of light and vitality. And there's made in all different styles. So brilliant. Yeah. Oh, also people can join up as a member, an individual member, and you come to our tastings and events and so on, if you'd like to.
Great, thank you very much. Well, you've given us a perfect segue into Mark to talk to us about Italy. So what have you discovered in terms of bottling diversity on your travels in Italy in particular, Mark?
Well, I've been writing about wine for 40 years now, and as really outlined, the grapevine is still very biodiverse, 10,000 different varieties. I think Jancis Robinson says there are 1,368 vines in commercial production. I think she's mainly talking Vitis vinifera, the European grapevine, and about 600 of those are in Italy. So there's an incredible biodiversity in Italy. But as Sarah was saying, it's not just about the number of vines, it's about how vines are connected directly to regions, to localities, and they're much more than just a range of different flavors. They're part of a soul of an area. They're linked to history, to culture, to identity, and for that reason, historically as well, Italy, of course, only became a nation in 1860. And before that, there were principalities, dukedoms, kingdoms, a lot of different nationalities within the peninsula. And those local identities, even more than regional identities, rivalries between cities and towns just miles away have remained. And that identity remains in food and certainly in wine. So great varieties are planted, good varieties that you wonder why they wouldn't be planted elsewhere. A grape variety like Verdicchio, for example, which I think is one of the great white wine grape varieties of the world, is only grown in Le Marche. And sticking to the old vines, Sarah will know well, the Nerello Mascalese of Etna, these wonderful ungrafted wines that grow out of volcanic soil, out of lava fields, vines that are over 100 years old in some cases. Nerello Mascalese really you find only on the slopes of Etna. And there are examples of this throughout the country, making wines with fascinating flavors. But why has it happened that, as Sarah outlined, we're reduced now to a handful of international varieties, mainly in markets around the world. And it is a market-driven issue, really, because it's easy for people to remember these names, these international names, and the market drives that, and vineyards replant, take up grape varieties, and sometimes they're at risk of extinction because growers think that they're going to make more money with a wine that is more familiar. And that's happening not just in Italy, but around the world. It is happening in Italy, but here, this is a country where those local grape varieties are grown simply because people love them. They like them, not to sell to international markets, but because it's what they drink, it's what they've always drunk, it's what they've drunk for generations. And so that's why Italy is a wonderful country, but it also makes it a bewildering country for others. It makes it difficult to understand. And people say to me, well, it's hard to get a handle on all these strange names and strange grape varieties. But I just say, well, choose a wine that you've never heard of. That's the way to discover Italian wine.
Isn't that part of the fun of it? The exploration, kind of not being able to get to the end of it.
Sorry, my sound just went there.
All right. I was saying, isn't that part of the fun of it? That
is exactly part of the fun of it. That is a great deal of the fun of it, and I think that would be my message to wine drinkers, not just with Italian wine, but it is to be bold, to be adventurous, to seek out what you don't know rather than what's familiar.
And are there any lessons that winemakers in other countries should be learning from Italy and the way that they do things?
Well, I do think that one should really be not feeling that you have to limit yourself to a flavor palette that is an international palette. These grape varieties can be really quite, and not just talking about Italy, but some of the countries that Sarah works with. Through Sarah, I've been introduced to some magnificent wines from Georgia, the home of wine, where wine originated, with grape varieties that I'd never heard of, that have such fascinating flavors. So I think wine growers around the world should respect what they have. In the New World, for example, there are criolla varieties that are blends of Vitis vinifera with grape varieties that were native to the Americas that are making some fascinating flavors, quite different to European styles of wine. And so one really has to appreciate what one has and not feel you have to chase that international market, that pot of gold.
That's such a good message. Absolutely, couldn't agree more. Let's move on to Chava. I think mezcal and tequila are having a bit of a moment. They're kind of the hot new spirit that everyone's getting into, and lots of celebrities doing their own brands and things. Tell us about what you're doing in that world.
Well, it's really fascinating to me when people say that, because they've been saying that for the last 15 years. So it's the longest moment that a spirit has had that comes to mind. But I really love what both Sarah and Mark said, because I think agave spirits, actually, I prefer to call them agave spirits, because, I mean, just in terms of names, I don't know if this happens to wine, but it's super fascinating to me that even the way they call the spirit in different towns in Mexico is distinct. To give you an example, in the center and north of Mexico, it has happened to me that you appear in a distillation facility that they also call in very different ways. They call it taberna, vinata, palenque, tachica. They have dozens of names to this. So when you get to anywhere you're asking for agave spirits, you have to ask them, how do you call this? And it's happened to me that I get there and they're like, well, would you like to drink some wine? Like, wine? I came here for the spirits, but sure, I'll have a glass of wine. It's just that they call it vino, the word in Spanish to refer to wine, because for them, they are making wine out of the agave. And they call mezcal the agave itself. So just starting with language, you are up to a very steep hill to climb if you're getting to the agave spirits world. And as you're mentioning, Sarah, like something that it's amazing to me is the struggle embedded in these drinks. I claim that you have to be the most stubborn artisan in the planet to be into agave. You have to really have no interest in making your life easier. Like I'm drinking this beautiful thing here from Michoacan. As you can see, a lot of the things that I will have in my house are not branded, not labeled, but by my unreadable handwriting. And it's made by a species called Inachidens. So something fascinating about agave as well is we, in the wine world, you start with Vitis vitifera, and then you have this explosion of diversity. In agave, we have specieses. We have thousands of species to start with, and the varietals, we haven't even started to scratch the surface of that. So nobody knows to this day how many species and varietals there are. I know so many examples of agaves that I know they're different, but I just haven't had the budget or the charisma to convince a taxonomist to go and actually label that properly. So it's basically the ultimate Tower of Babel. And what is really fascinating is like all this discourse of actually trying to narrow that is slightly new. That started a little bit with the phenomena of tequila, where they wanted to reach a bigger market, and they're like, okay, we're not gonna be able to convince millions of people in the world to remember all these weird agave names, all these different ways to name this, all these different places where they're made. Diversity is hard to communicate, I believe. I think that's one of our biggest challenges, right? So they decided to narrow it down, say like, okay, this is tequila from this region. We're gonna decide that this very explosive flavor attached to this agave is gonna be what is gonna be representative to the world, to be called agave spirits and for people to think about Mexico. And then we sort of buried a lot of the diversity that was behind it. Now with mezcal, fortunately, that's starting to expand, but even still it's mostly connected to the south of Mexico, namely Oaxaca. And Oaxaca, it's a gorgeously diverse place. I mean, if you drive around Oaxaca, you're like, how can a place have so much information in such a tiny space? You know, from one town to the other, there's a massive mountain. So you make actually 8 hours, even if it's close in distance, but they have different languages. They will use different words for water and sun in two places that are like 50 kilometers away, 8 hours away, but 50 kilometers away. But still, like right now, 90% of all the mezcal that we drink in the world comes from Oaxaca. A lot of what we do with Lou, which is not here because he's in an airplane, we have an NGO called Sacred, Saving Agave for Recreation Education. And I don't never remember the acronym, but you can find it on the website. And what we try to convince a lot of people to be more adventurous, as you're saying, Mark. Like if you love espadín and if you love your tequila, go out there, find this agave that you cannot pronounce to save your life and drink it. And if you're going to hate it with a passion. If you're going to love it with a passion, and just like get deeper into this labyrinth. And I think that unlike wine, I'm so jealous of you guys because you have so much documentation. You have books and you have kings writing down which varietal was served when they got crowned. You have all this history behind you. Here we have oral history. When you ask a mezcalero, how long has your family been doing this? It's like, well, I met my granddad. That's how much I know. There's no written history about this spirit, or there's archaeological evidence, maybe. There's a few things that we can go back to, but a lot of it is still like if you were thinking about wine 200 years ago. You can still go to places where the time has stopped, definitely, and they're still using mixes of Asian distillation with European distillation. So you can go in places in Mexico where they're distilling almost like if they were Mongolians or Koreans. And that's beyond explanations, just because they decided that the flavor profile of the specific agaves that grew there, they were better distilling them and fermenting it in a certain way. And I think that's my elevator speech. Was that fast enough?
Yeah, that's very inspiring. So what would you love people to do who are, if they're all kind of now wanted to go out and find some great agave drinks, what should they do?
Well, first thing is come to Mexico. I think that is the one first thing that it's a little bit like what Mark is saying. I always say Italy is the Latin America of Europe. So if you love Italy, you're going to go crazy in Mexico. So come here. And if you, please. Great wine too. The wine scene here is getting really nice. And the other thing is really like, we think that you can make a significant change on the course that agave can take. Agave spirits are what wine was 100 years ago when making decisions of markets and how it was going to expand and how it was being communicated to a broader audience. So instead of drinking, if you're going to drink 10 times agave spirits, well, make 4 of those some agave that was produced outside of Oaxaca or outside of Jalisco. And in that way, you're going to promote for farmers, you're going to promote for towns to be more into diversity, because what they're going to understand is people are interested in drinking diversity. We don't have to go down and chop the jungle and plant row after row after row after row of tequila and Agave, because that's what we think the market does. So again, like, you're going to have a more enjoyable time. You're going to sound a lot smarter because you're going to know more names of agaves, and you're going to be promoting diversity in Mexico.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Absolutely.
So if I could afford to, I'd be on the next flight to Mexico right now.
Me too.
Please.
Gabe, are apples the agave of the west of England?
Maybe, possibly. It's certainly not quite as dry and intense as it is within Mexico, but in terms of, you're going over the hill and there being a different language, it's not quite like that. Although if you do go into the Forest of Dean, it is quite hard to understand anything that they say there. And I'm from the edge of there originally. But with certain pear varieties, especially cider apples a little bit, some of these peri pears especially, they have lots of synonyms. So the same variety is called different things in different places. So there's a pear variety called Moorcroft, which came from Moorcroft Farm in the Malvern Hills. In the Vale of Berkeley, it's called Malvern Hills because it comes from the Malvern Hills. In my village of Dimmock, it's called Stinking Bishop, because the farmer on which the variety originated from was old Farmer Bishop, and so miserly, such a horrible, miserable bugger was he, that he was known as old Bishop, old Stinking Bishop. What do you want to see him for? So he managed to his miserliness managed to attach itself to a variety, which is quite impressive. And as it happens, Stinking Bishop is more broadly known today because that's the name of a cheese which is rind washed in that variety by Charles Martel in my village of Dimmock. But yeah, I've got 2 drinks to talk about here, Pete. So maybe I'll get 6 minutes.
You're gone.
We'll see.
We're doing well. Everyone's been very good.
All right. First of all, I feel a little bit hard done by, but I've got to follow Mr. Charisma here, Chava. Not quite charismatic enough. Come on. That's not fair. Plus, we've got the weight of the wine industry as well. Come to poor old cider, much maligned cider. Everybody knows cider, and generally lots of people would have a preconception about it. And that's not always necessarily a particularly positive perspective. It could be the mainstream drink that is more broadly made and consumed within the UK today. That's a result of partly on the growing side of things, that I'll come on to orchards and varieties in a moment, but certainly in terms of consumer trends in the post-war era, more going to the pub, more consumption, more consumable spend at that point, and cider being commodified. And dare I say, Pete, it was the brewing industry that got their teeth into cider making and said, this cider lark, we could make it a bit more like a beer, a bit more water, and let's tweak it and let's squeeze it and let's make it a nice bit cheaper, and let's put it in a keg and let's sell it by the pint. Not that that's necessarily a bad thing, but that is major driver of where cider has gone to over the course of the last 60 years. And so that, that's where we are today. And depending on where you are in the world, there is different bits of legislation as to how much apple juice there is allowed to be within that drink in order for it to constitute a cider. In the UK, that figure is 35%. So the majority of the drink can be water, a minority can be apple juice and still be classified as a cider. Now, there are some people who will be watching this who I suspect would demand that anything that was called cider was 100% apple juice. I'm not quite so pitchfork wielding. I'm a little bit more of a sort of pragmatist, but certainly if something is not a majority of apple juice, for me, that does not constitute a cider. But certainly from a UK perspective, and in fact, all around the world, there are hundreds. In fact, there are thousands of varieties, especially in the old world areas, the western parts of the UK, northern France, Normandy and Brittany, in Luxembourg, in the Hessen region of Western Germany, of course, in Asturias and in the Basque country in Galicia and Cantabria. There's a very, very old heritage of cider making here, with varieties that have been grown for the sole and specific purpose of making the drink. They were never intended, first of all, to eat. And depending on which part of those old world regions you're in, they have quite different flavor profiles. In northern Spain, they tend to be a little bit more acid driven. In northern France and in the western parts of the UK, they're very much more tannic driven. And so I could list you literally hundreds of apple varieties that you will probably have never heard of, because they don't tend to be front and center of what the larger cider makers top 5 cider makers, but in the UK account for about 90% of the volume. So just in terms of having the visibility of any cider that really does advocate apple varieties, it's quite a hard thing to do. So if I were to say Tremlett's Bitter or Yarlington Mill or Dabonet, these are key apple varieties from western parts of the UK, not so known about. And of course, there's loads of silly names as well. Cider Lady's Finger, Slack McGirdle, Brown Snout. We could go on. And it is great fun. And each one of them is idiosyncratic, different, and pronounces itself from an aromatic, from a visual coloration, from a taste, and from a textural mouthfeel point of view. The synergies and the crossovers between cider and wine are quite big in terms of that varietal nature, and in terms of celebrating that range and diversity and lamenting, and that those varieties being embedded into the history and the culture and the identity of the place, like Mark was talking about. It's exactly the same for cider. So my urge to anybody watching this is to get out there and try and find the local varieties or the traditional ciders kind of from your area. So we've got this mainstream. We've also got maybe some very rustic traditional ciders that are not always necessarily made with a huge amount of due diligence and care, so they can display some characteristics that make them just quite unappealing to the majority of consumers, or indeed independent cider experts. But fortunately, there is a raft of small, independent, micro and smaller micro producers who are celebrating varieties and process. I'm drinking right now something from the Ross and Wise Cider and Perry Company, which is in Herefordshire. This is a 2015 harvest, single varietal Tremlett's Bitter, which, as the name suggests, it is quite intensely bitter, tannic, but they've mellowed off over the last 7 and a bit years or so. The variety comes from Devon originally. It's wild fermented. It comes from unsprayed orchards. This is what this small band of like-minded people are trying to advocate: varieties, minimization of process, but crucially celebrating orchards. These are magical environments such that the old orchards, the standard orchards as we would call them, in the continent they often call them meadow orchards, big trees, well spaced apart, high canopy so you can graze your livestock underneath. These are the same as the old vines, and in terms of the intensity of the flavor profile that comes from the fruit from those, the minimal intervention, the maximum amount of fertilizer they're going to get is from the sheep droppings or from the cow pats. We're talking about little arcs and little voyages into the varieties, traditional and cultural, to those particular areas, and it's great fun and fascinating. A little bit like if you've never heard of a certain grape variety, go for it, give it a try. You might like it, you might not, but that is part of the fun. It's the same with cider. And these old orchards, similar to heritage vineyards, absolutely, we're talking about not just their value from the biodiversity of the fruit, but of the ecology as well. These are proxies for woodland areas, these high trees with canopy. They generally have hedgerows around them. They generally have a big sward. The invertebrates, the bird life, it's the main habitat for the lesser spotted woodpecker, which is very rare in the UK now. These old orchards are under the UK Biodiversity Action Plan. So, highly regarded are they as that ecological environment. So it's magical stuff. And then we've got Perry, which is so similar to cider in terms of the way that you make it. It's made from pears rather than apples. And there is a heritage of making this drink from specific varieties grown solely for the purpose of making the drink in Gloucestershire, Herefordshire, and Worcestershire, the area that I'm from, near the Welsh border in England, the Domfront area of Normandy. In Austria, you've got the Mostviertel, this 200-kilometer long valley. There are areas outside of the UK that grow these indigenous varieties for this sole drink, but they don't look or taste like any dessert pear that you ever come across. If somebody says, here, try this Perry pear, you must have done something mightily to annoy them, because, again, very rich tannin, they will turn your mouth inside out. And Dan Saladino focused upon Perry within the book Eating to Extinction, because there aren't many of these trees left. It's quite a hard drink to make. It's very easy for it to go faulty. The trees are generally, very, very large and tall. Some of them they're on the tree, they're underripe, you turn your corner, they've splattered on the ground. Others you have to pick in November, and then you have to mill in the January because they're so rock hard. Also, they contain a degree of an unfermentable sugar called sorbitol, which, if consumed in large quantities, can lead to some laxative effects. So there's lots of reasons why Perry never became the big drink, but that doesn't mean that it shouldn't be celebrated, championed, and conserved as much as any other drink. It is a magical thing. I feel very, very lucky because I'm from the epicenter of where this drink is made. And these varieties, they really are sort of links and lineages to my family's past. There's a thorn pear tree on the ancestral home since 1908. And you know, I know that my granddad, who died before I was born, he made perry from that drink. Means something to me. That's really cool. That me picking that fruit and making it, that was something really, really wonderful. And the age and the antiquity of these pear trees. There's one of the oldest houses in the UK is called Helen's. It's in the village of Muchmartle in Herefordshire. And like any self-respecting manor house, it's got a lovely long undulating driveway leading up to it. And it should have some oak or beech trees lining this driveway, but it doesn't. It has perry pear trees that were planted in 1710 to commemorate the coronation of Queen Anne. They're still there, 13 years on. And one of the trees on there is a variety called waterlug. And that is the only known mature specimen of that variety known anywhere in the world. Cuttings have been taken from it to place in a couple of museum orchards. But imagine that, that's the only thing in existence of that. If I were to say, if this were the white rhino, we'd be treating it a little bit differently in terms of our conservation of it. That might be a little bit melodramatic. We might have a slightly more emotive kind of reaction to a mammal than to a pear tree. But I tell you what, they are absolutely magical things. And you know, I have had the opportunity to make a perry from. There's another tree, cowslip. Only one tree left, and I've made perry from it. And I know that I would be the only person in the world making that drink. That's just pretty cool.
It's incredible. It's incredible. I'm going to have to shut you up, unfortunately.
Yes, good. Thank you.
You know how much I do like listening to you. And perry is just an absolute treasure trove, isn't it? It's just so wonderful. But we need to give some time to John, who is going to be talking to us about old grain varieties, which is close to my heart because, among other things, grain makes beer. John, what are you up to at the Oxford Artisan Distillery?
Oh, thank you, Pete. I mean, that was so wonderful. I don't want to block that amazing flow of chat because it's I don't know what I'm going to drink after this. I should be saying I'm going to sip our gin, our Oxford rye gin or rye or something, but boy, I'm going to reach for some cider or some wine. What we're up to in Oxford, well, you know, it's interesting listening to all this. We obviously all have so much in common in what we're trying to do, preserve. You know, it's that mixture of flavor, resilience, and sustainability all coming together. The winds are finally blowing in this direction, at least a little bit, I think, which is great. And I'm listening to everyone, and you're all working with things that are still alive. There's still a tradition. You still have your old agaves and your old grapevines and your old perries. They're hanging on. I know it's been very difficult. We've lost so much of that diversity. And in terms of grain, whether that's barley or wheat or rye or oats, in the UK, it's pretty much gone. It was lost when we moved to industrial farming. So our grains only survive in gene banks, frozen. And even then we lose them there because they need to be grown out and the gene banks don't always have their resources. So to answer the question, what we're doing at the Oxford Artisan Distillery is really resurrecting varieties, mostly, I have to say, from gene banks. So I call them living gene bank populations. You can call them genetically diverse populations, or not quite a landrace. A landrace is something that has grown continuously in one area for a long time and is genetically diverse. There are a couple of handfuls of those things that have survived, bear barley and Orkney, a couple of things, but by and large, I've had to recreate that. And I've recreated these ancient pseudo land races, evolving gene bank populations based on fairly good, I think, accurate archaeological and botanical information. So I got a lot of information out of ancient medieval thatched roofs, so I know what those crops looked like. So I went around and I collected those, and I've been growing these populations for over 25 years. The rye is really uniquely diverse because rye cross-pollinates, wheat doesn't cross-pollinate. So So I'm a botanist. I did plant breeding and genetics, and then I was very lucky I wanted to know where we messed up, really, and you know, we messed up, some would say, in that transition from hunting and gathering to farming. And then farming at the beginning was probably working more in harmony with nature and biodiversity. and not exploiting it so much. But that's all changed. You mentioned I think Sarah mentioned the Green Revolution. It's affected all of us. It certainly caused a lot of problems in the grain world from my perspective. And yes, we have to feed people. But I think we can do that. Well, we're not feeding people at the moment very well. 60% of the grain we grow in the UK is fed to animals anyway. I think cows should probably eat grass rather than grain. But we do have to feed people. So I take that into account. And that was how my journey started off. But I pretty quickly got into sustainable grain production and archaeobotany. And so that's what we do at the distillery. We grow fields of mixed heritage. I call them heritage because to me that is pre-hybrid. If the minute you hybridize a crop, you make it uniform. So we use, and that was in the wheat world, that was about, in Britain, that was about 1906, early 1900s. So to me, heritage is pre-1900, thereabouts, where you have a lot of genetic diversity, because we all know that diversity gives us resilience and it gives us flavor. I noticed a comment, it's difficult to communicate that message of biodiversity. I like to refer to it, and I think it works for all of us, as a rainbow of flavors. You know, people talk about terroir in wine or in flour or possibly in beer. If you have one, terroir comes out of this, how that individual genetic line, let's say, this variety interacts with the soil and the weather and the conditions around there. And it will produce a certain type of grain, in my case, or grape in your case. Well, in a cereal field, if you have, that single variety will produce, the way I think of it is one red band in the rainbow, one slice of that rainbow of flavor and qualities that I think are beautiful to enjoy, and then a very narrow slice. Now, in the hands of a very good wine master or brewer, you can get a really nice brew, I'm sure. But I want that whole flavor. I want the whole rainbow in my glass. And so, aside from the resilience and the sustainability issues, so we grow these populations. They've now evolved for 25 years. They're well adapted to growing conditions in the Oxfordshire region. We mix wheat and rye in the same field because our master distiller loves to use both of those. And we're really a rye distillery, which is quite unusual. It's New World rye whiskey. But we do gin, we do all the other things. We do vodka, so we're growing those in quantity. We're stepping things up. Sustainability is at the core of what we do. We're, grain to glass, it really means something for us. We're producing our own grain, making our own alcohol in our own stills and using it in our products. It's growing. People are really interested. I think, I'd rather someone buy, I think we'd all agree, one good bottle of wine, even though it's a bit more expensive, rather than 3 bottles of, or the same for gin or whiskey, 3 bottles of mass-produced whiskey. So I still work to produce flour, and I'm moving more and more into the brewing world because I've also got populations of barley that I've been developing that include bare barley that you'd be familiar with, Pete. But whatever crop we grow and wherever we grow, to me, the greater the diversity genetically in that field, the more resilient it will be in terms of weather. And we know we have massive climate change coming. As a plant breeder, you've got to think, well, all of us, not just as a plant breeder, but we got to think 20 years ahead, 15 years ahead. And so I'm mixing in varieties that are drought tolerant and various things. So I'm constantly adding diversity to these populations. And they're working. I mean, it's working. The yield is very stable. The quality is stable from year to year. If you have a modern variety that's genetically uniform, let's say of a barley, and they have shallow root systems. They've been modern wheat, for example, has got a very shallow root system adapting because of the way plant breeding worked with the Green Revolution. So ours have really deep root systems. They bring up all those lovely nutrients from deep below the ground and add that to the flavor. There are many things we know that contribute to flavor and fermentation, obviously the way the distiller does it and the brewer does it. But I think grain is still a really important part of that flavor and carries right on through to that final product. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. That's really inspiring. We've got about 5 minutes left. We're allowed to go until 10 to. So I wondered now we've been around the room. I'm kind of looking at the chat, and if anyone's got a very quick question, please put it in the chat. But having gone through everyone, going back to Sarah and Mark, who haven't spoken for a while, what's everyone's kind of thoughts now after hearing from across so many different drinks?
Can I just say, I think that what really struck me is how, although with agave and cider and perry, you know, the great presentations, I've been so great, you know, you've kind of got a brave new world, and what you are not yet held back by is this fear that wine has managed to kind of bequeath to anyone coming near wine, the fear of choosing the wrong thing, saying the wrong thing, tasting the wrong thing. And fear really puts people off from going and frolicking in the diversity of wine. And I think that actually, I feel that we in wine have a lot to learn about making this diversity a source of like playful, frolicking joy. Rather than, you know, in wine, I feel that we slightly, you know, and the other thing about wine is that I think the mistake we made is that we've made our farming quite opaque, you know, and actually I notice in the way that that certainly the cider revolution, which I've been a bit more aware of than Perry, I must admit, you know, that it's very transparent the way they talk about their farming. And we found when we talk about old vineyards and the story, you know, that you said, Gabe, that your grandfather had planted, there are these similar stories. I was talking to a winemaker in Italy recently, and he is cultivating a tiny vineyard planted by his great grandfather. He makes 4,000 bottles of this very particular clone, this type of grape variety. It's completely unique. He makes 4,000 bottles a year, and you know, and no one's ever really heard of him. But my friend Michelle Shah, who's my contact in literature, the wines are delicious. And just one thing I think it's worth saying is that it's economic diversity, and that what we found when we work with these grape growers working with old vineyards, like in South Africa, it has transformed the economic prosperity of these farmers. It's transformed them in Chile, in Male, the Vinho project, and it's taken something that was kind of overlooked by being kind of a bit local, you know, not being a noble variety, all these kind of weird ideas of what can be beautiful. You know, I think this whole consideration for food diversity is that it's biodiversity, but it's also culturally diverse and it's economically diverse. And they make very high value, desirable, truly authentically beautiful products, not kind of ostentation or a kind of manufactured luxury. They're things that people will feel good paying more for. And they're delicious. And I think in alcohol, we have to go the way of quality, because, you know, a little bit of what you fancy in alcohol is best.
Yeah. Can I say something super quick, Sarah? I always claim that the only reason why I'm interested in agave spirits is because they were the motor of celebration in Mexico. And without traditional celebrations, mezcal would have died. For decades, it was cheaper than water and Coca-Cola. Water and Coca-Cola was more expensive than selling mezcal. So economically, it made no sense to keep on doing this. But it was so ingrained in, we cannot have a wedding, we cannot baptize our child just drinking some industrial stuff that they put in the little store. This is the most important day of my life. It has to come with a spirit that it's able to communicate where we are and who we are. So I think like celebration has to be at the core. I mean, ultimately, we all love to get a little bit drunk with this and to have a good time, right? And it has to be delicious, but without celebration, I think we're like, it's absolutely nonsense.
Yeah. I think just to sum up, what I find absolutely delightful is that, you know, conversations like this, there's a lot of stuff about the importance of ecology and sustainability and diversity, but every single person has said, no, but the taste is just fantastic. You know, this is not an onerous job, is it? It's we're all working in things that produce absolutely wonderful flavors, and that exploration side of things. I always said Gabe's very lucky to live where he does. Someone, it's like, I can't get those good ciders in London. If I want them, I have to go to Herefordshire or Somerset to get them. Same as we have to come to Mexico to get those fantastic agaves, and that exploration is a wonderful thing in itself, and just it's a nice way to live your life, isn't it? We do have to end there, unfortunately. I always knew that this is something that we could carry on for hours if we wanted to, if we were able to. I think it's a wonderful way to end today, and hopefully this is not the last time that we talk like this. I wish we were all in a pub just now so we could go and get a drink together and all kind of give each other some recommendations on what we should be drinking. But thank you so much, Sarah, Mark, Chava, Gabe, and John. I hope the audience has enjoyed that and given you some food for thought or drink for thought. But thank you very much for joining us. Cheers.
Thank you,
everyone.
Pete. Thank you, everybody.
Cheers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete.